When Clara Hartwell traveled west as a mail-order bride in 1885, she never expected to be cast aside within weeks for a devastating secret that made her worthless in her intended husband's eyes. But when two motherless children began appearing at her door with wildflowers and whispered pleas, Clara discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the deepest rejections. Will the same man who once called her barren prove worthy of the woman whose heart could heal his broken family? The train whistle screamed through the cold mountain air like a wounded animal, and Clara Hartwell pressed her face against the dirty window as the locomotive slowed to a stop. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the wooden sign that read Millfield, Colorado Territory, population 847. This was it. This was where her new life would begin, or where her old one would finally end. Clara grabbed her worn carpet bag and stepped onto the platform. The February wind hit her like a slap, cutting through her best wool coat as if it were made of paper. Snow crunched under her button-up boots, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The air was so thin she could barely catch her breath. Boston had never prepared her for this wild, empty place. Around her, other passengers hurried toward waiting wagons or walked quickly into town. But Clara stood alone, searching the crowd for a face she'd only seen in a small photograph. Thomas Mitchell was supposed to meet her here. They were supposed to be married tomorrow at the Methodist Church. She touched the letter in her coat pocket, the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. The train pulled away with a great cloud of black smoke, taking with it her last chance to change her mind. Clara picked up her bag and walked toward the main street. The town looked like something from a storybook, with wooden buildings lined up like crooked teeth against the mountain backdrop. Signs creaked in the wind: Miller's General Store, Henderson's boarding house, Doc Morrison's office. A man in a heavy coat approached her. "Miss Hartwell?" Clara's stomach jumped. "Yes, that's me." He tipped his hat. "I'm Bill Henderson. My wife runs the boarding house. Mr. Mitchell asked me to collect you. He's been delayed." Something cold settled in Clara's chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "Delayed? He'll explain everything. Come along, let's get you somewhere warm." They walked down the muddy main street, past curious faces peering from shop windows. Clara felt their stares like pinpricks. In a town this small, everyone would know she was the mail-order bride from back east. Everyone would be watching to see if Thomas Mitchell's gamble would pay off. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was a 3-story building with yellow curtains in the windows and smoke curling from 2 chimneys. It looked warm and welcoming, but Clara's unease grew with each step. Why hadn't Thomas come to meet her himself? Inside, the house smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Mrs. Henderson was a plump woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She showed Clara to a small room on the 2nd floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. "Mr. Mitchell will call on you tomorrow," Mrs. Henderson said, setting down a pitcher of warm water. "He wanted you to have time to rest after your journey." After the woman left, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out Thomas's letter. She'd read it so many times she knew it by heart. He'd written about his ranch outside town, about needing a wife to help build a life in Colorado. He'd seemed kind in his words, practical but not unkind. He'd sent money for her train ticket and promised to provide for her. But he hadn't come to meet her. Clara unpacked her few belongings, hanging her other dress in the small wardrobe and placing her mother's Bible on the washstand. Through the thin walls, she could hear other guests moving around, talking in low voices. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed 6 times. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. A group of children ran past, laughing and throwing snowballs. 2 women stood talking outside the general store, their heads bent together. A man on horseback rode slowly down the street, his breath and his horse's breath making white clouds in the cold air. This was her new world. These were the people she would live among, shop with, go to church with. The thought should have excited her, but instead it made her feel more alone than ever. A knock at her door made her jump. "Miss Hartwell? Supper's ready if you'd like to come down." Clara smoothed her skirts and checked her hair in the small mirror above the washstand. Her reflection looked pale and tired, but there was nothing to be done about that now. She opened the door and followed the smell of beef stew and cornbread downstairs. The dining room held a long table surrounded by 8 chairs. 3 other guests were already seated: an elderly man who introduced himself as Mr. Peterson, a young couple named the Johnsons, and a woman traveling to visit her sister in Denver. They were polite but curious, asking about her journey and her plans. "So you're to marry Thomas Mitchell," said Mrs. Johnson with a smile. "He's a good man. Lost his first wife 2 years ago in childbirth. Terrible sad business." Clara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Thomas had mentioned being a widower in his letter, but he hadn't told her how his wife died. Or that it was so recent. He has 2 little ones, Mr. Peterson added. Sweet children, but they need a mother's touch. Children. Thomas had mentioned children too, but not how young they were or how much they might still be grieving their real mother. After supper, Clara returned to her room and sat by the window watching the town settle into evening quiet. Lamplight glowed in windows up and down the street. Somewhere, Thomas Mitchell was in one of those houses, perhaps wondering about the woman he'd agreed to marry. Perhaps having second thoughts. Clara pressed her hand against the cold glass and made a silent promise to herself. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with courage. She'd come too far to turn back now. But as she prepared for bed, one question kept spinning in her mind like a prayer she didn't dare speak aloud. What if Thomas Mitchell took one look at her and decided she wasn't worth the risk? I need to speak with you privately. Thomas Mitchell's voice cut through the morning quiet of the boarding house parlor like an axe through wood, and Clara's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. She'd been waiting for him since sunrise, dressed in her best blue dress with her hair pinned up neat and proper. When he'd finally arrived, she'd expected nervousness, maybe awkwardness. She hadn't expected the hard line of his mouth or the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Of course, Clara managed, her voice smaller than she intended. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway as if she'd been listening. You can use the front parlor. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. The front parlor was the boarding house's finest room, with a flowered sofa and matching chairs arranged around a small table. Lace curtains filtered the morning sunlight, casting soft patterns on the carpet. It should have been a pleasant place for a conversation between a man and his intended bride. Instead, it felt like a courtroom. Thomas remained standing while Clara sat on the edge of the sofa. He was taller than she'd expected from his photograph, with dark hair and broad shoulders that spoke of hard work. His clothes were clean but worn, the clothes of a man who worked with his hands. In his photograph, he'd been smiling. Now his face looked like it was carved from stone. Miss Hartwell, he began, then stopped. He walked to the window and stared out at the street. This is difficult. Clara's chest tightened. What's difficult, Mr. Mitchell? He turned back to her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. It was the look of a man who'd made a mistake and didn't know how to fix it. I've been to see Doc Morrison, he said. Clara blinked. The doctor? Are you ill? No. Thomas sat down across from her, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. I asked him about you. About your condition. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My condition? Your letter mentioned that you'd been to doctors in Boston. That there were complications. His voice was gentle, but his words hit Clara like physical blows. Doc Morrison knows physicians back east. He sent a telegram. Clara's face burned with shame and shock. You investigated me? I had to know. Thomas leaned forward, and for a moment his mask slipped, showing the desperate man underneath. Miss Hartwell, I lost my first wife bringing my son into the world. Before that, she lost 2 babies. I can't. I won't go through that again. The room was so quiet Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Outside, someone was hammering nails and the sound echoed like gunshots. What did the doctor tell you? She whispered. Thomas stood up again, unable to sit still. That you've been to 4 different physicians in Boston. That they all said the same thing. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. That you can't have children. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Clara had known this moment would come eventually. She just hoped it would be later, after Thomas had gotten to know her, after he'd seen that she could be a good wife in other ways. I wanted to tell you myself, she said, her voice barely audible. I was going to tell you today. Were you? Thomas's voice was sharp now. Or were you hoping I wouldn't find out until after we were married? Clara stood up, anger giving her strength. That's not fair. I never lied to you. You didn't tell me the truth either. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. The words burst out of her louder than she intended. I knew you'd look at me like I'm broken, like I'm worthless. I don't think you're worthless. But Thomas's voice lacked conviction. Don't you? Clara stepped closer to him, her hands shaking. Then why does it matter so much? I could be a good wife to you. I can cook and clean and mend clothes. I could help raise the children you already have. Why isn't that enough? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. Because I need sons to help work the ranch. I need daughters to help in the house when they're grown. I need. He trailed off. You need a woman who can give you children, Clara finished. Yes. The simple word hit harder than any angry speech could have. Clara sank back onto the sofa, feeling suddenly exhausted. I'm sorry, Thomas said, and he sounded like he meant it. I know this isn't your fault. But I can't marry a woman who can't give me the family I need. Clara stared at her hands folded in her lap. What happens to me now? Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. There's money for your train ticket back to Boston. An extra $4 for your trouble. Clara looked at the envelope but didn't take it. Money. Like she was a business deal that hadn't worked out. The eastbound train comes through on Thursday, Thomas continued. That gives you 3 days to make arrangements. 3 days. 3 days to pack up her shattered dreams and go back to Boston with her tail between her legs. Back to her tiny rented room and her job sewing shirts for other women's husbands. Back to being alone. Miss Hartwell? Thomas was watching her with something that might have been concern. Are you all right? Clara almost laughed. All right? She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger only to be rejected before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. She was trapped in a tiny mountain town where everyone would soon know her business. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But instead of crying, instead of begging, she lifted her chin and looked Thomas Mitchell straight in the eye. I'm fine, she lied. Thank you for your honesty. Thomas nodded stiffly and moved toward the door. I'll ask Mrs. Henderson to put your room charges on my account. It's the least I can do. After he left, Clara sat alone in the pretty parlor with its flowered sofa and lace curtains. Through the window, she could see the mountains rising up like giants against the sky. Somewhere out there was the ranch that would never be her home, the life that would never be hers. She picked up the envelope Thomas had left behind, feeling its weight in her hands. Inside was her future, a train ticket back to everything she'd tried to escape. But as she sat there in the quiet room, listening to the sounds of the town waking up outside, one thought kept pushing its way into her mind. If Thomas Mitchell had children who needed a mother, and if she was going to be stuck in Millfield for 3 more days anyway, what harm could there be in taking a walk around town? The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet, followed by a child's terrified scream that made Clara drop her sewing and rush to her window. Down in the muddy street below, a small girl with tangled red hair was backed against the wall of Miller's general store, her eyes wide with fear as 3 older boys circled her like wolves. One held a broken bottle, its jagged edges catching the sunlight. The girl clutched something against her chest, a torn cloth doll that looked like it had seen better days. Give it here, Emmy Mitchell, the biggest boy yelled. You're mine, coming back for that stupid doll. Clara's heart clenched as she recognized the name. These were Thomas's children, the ones he'd mentioned, the ones who'd lost their mother. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran downstairs, her feet flying over the wooden steps. By the time she reached the street, a small crowd had gathered. But nobody was helping. They just stood there watching like it was some kind of show. Please, the little girl, Emmy was saying, tears streaming down her dirty face. It was Mama's. It's all I got left of her. The boy with the bottle laughed, a mean sound that made Clara's blood boil. Your pa should have thought of that before he tried to replace her with some fancy lady from back east. Clara pushed through the crowd. That's enough. The boys turned to look at her and she saw they were maybe 12 or 13 years old. Old enough to know better, but young enough to still be cruel without thinking. This ain't your business, lady, the biggest one said. It is now. Clara stepped between Emmy and the boys, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Why don't you find something better to do than pick on a little girl? She started it, one of the other boys said, but he sounded less sure now that a grown-up was involved. Clara looked down at Emmy, who was maybe 7 years old and couldn't weigh more than a sack of flour. Did you really start trouble with 3 boys twice your size? Emmy shook her head, wiping her nose with her sleeve. I was just walking to the store like Papa told me. They said mean things about Mama and I told them to stop. Then Bobby threw a rock at my doll and it hit the window instead. Clara looked at the broken storefront window, then at the boys. Which one of you is Bobby? The biggest boy straightened up, trying to look tough. That's me. What of it? What of it is that you owe Mr. Miller for his window and you owe this little girl an apology? Bobby's face turned red. I ain't apologizing to no Mitchell. Her pa thinks he's better than everyone else, bringing in some mail-order bride like we ain't good enough for him. The words hit Clara like a slap, but she kept her face calm. So the whole town knew about her situation. Of course they did. In a place this small, news traveled faster than wildfire. What Mr. Mitchell does is his business, Clara said quietly. But what you do is yours. And right now you're acting like a bully. An older woman in the crowd spoke up. Bobby Henderson, you get on home this minute. Wait till I tell your ma what you've been up to. The boys scattered like leaves in the wind, but not before Bobby shot Clara a look that promised this wasn't over. Clara watched them go, then knelt down next to Emmy. Are you hurt, sweetheart? Emmy shook her head, but she was still crying. They broke Mama's doll. Look. She held up the rag doll and Clara could see that its arm had been torn loose. Stuffing was leaking out like cotton snow. Oh, honey. Clara gently took the doll and examined it. You know what? I think I can fix this. I'm pretty good with a needle and thread. Emmy's eyes went wide. Really? You can make her better. I can try. But first, let's get you cleaned up. Where's your papa? He went to check the cattle with Mr. Johnson. He said I should go to the store and get flour for tonight's bread. Emmy wiped her nose again. But I can't go in there now. Mr. Miller's gonna be so mad about his window. Clara looked at the broken glass scattered on the wooden sidewalk. A man was already coming out of the store with a broom, his face dark as a thundercloud. Mr. Miller? Clara called. I saw what happened. The Henderson boy broke your window. He ran off, but I'm sure his parents will make it right. The storekeeper looked at her, then at Emmy. That so? Well, I suppose it wasn't the child's fault then. His voice softened a little. You all right, Emmy girl? Emmy nodded, staying close to Clara's side. Come on, Clara said, taking the little girl's hand. Let's get that flour your papa needs and then we'll see about fixing your doll. Inside the general store, Clara was surprised by how much it reminded her of the shops back in Boston. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from bolts of cloth to pickled eggs in big glass jars. The smell of coffee and leather and soap mixed together in a way that was somehow comforting. Emmy knew exactly what to get: 5 pounds of flour, a jar of molasses, and a pound of salt. Clara watched her count out coins from a small purse, her tongue poking out a little as she concentrated on the math. Your papa taught you numbers well, Clara said. Mama did, before she went to heaven, Emmy replied matter-of-factly. She said a lady needs to know how to figure money so nobody can cheat her. Clara's throat tightened. This little girl had lost her mother so young, but she was trying so hard to remember what she'd been taught. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Emmy chattered away like a little bird. Are you really the lady who was gonna marry Papa? Clara's step faltered. How did you know about that? Everybody knows. Mrs. Patterson told Mrs. Johnson at church that Papa had sent for a wife from back east. She said you were real pretty and educated. Emmy looked up at her with curious eyes. How come you didn't marry him? The innocent question cut deeper than any of the cruel words the boys had thrown at her. How could she explain to a 7-year-old that her father didn't want a wife who couldn't give him more children? Sometimes grown-ups make plans that don't work out, Clara said carefully. Like when Mama planned to teach me to make apple pie, but then she got sick and went to heaven instead? Clara's eyes filled with tears. Something like that, yes? They reached the boarding house and Clara led Emmy upstairs to her small room. She sat the little girl on the narrow bed and went to get her sewing basket from the wardrobe. This is nice, Emmy said, looking around. Mama would have liked the yellow curtains. Clara pulled out her needle and thread, choosing colors that matched the doll's faded dress. Tell me about your mama. Emmy's face lit up. She was the prettiest lady in the whole world. She had hair like mine, but not so messy. And she could sing like the angels in church. She used to sing to me and Jamie when we couldn't sleep. Jamie? My little brother. He's only 5 and he cries a lot since Mama died. Papa doesn't know what to do with him. Emmy watched Clara's careful stitches. Papa doesn't know what to do with me neither. He tries, but he gets all mixed up when I ask about girl things. Clara's heart ached for this motherless child. What kind of girl things? Like how to braid my hair proper, or why my stomach hurts sometimes, or what it means when the older girls whisper about becoming a lady someday. Emmy sighed. Papa just gets red in the face and says to ask Mrs. Patterson, but she's got 6 kids of her own and no time for questions. As Clara worked on the doll, Emmy kept talking. She told about her brother Jamie, who was scared of thunderstorms and still sucked his thumb when he thought nobody was looking. She talked about how their papa worked from dawn till dusk, trying to keep the ranch going by himself. She mentioned the hired man who'd quit last month because Papa couldn't pay him regular wages. Papa's real sad all the time now, Emmy said quietly. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. He looks at Mama's picture and gets that crinkle between his eyes. Clara finished repairing the doll's arm and handed it back. Emmy hugged it tight, her face glowing with joy. She's all better. Thank you, Miss Clara. You're very welcome, sweetheart. Emmy was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Clara with serious eyes. Miss Clara? How come you didn't marry Papa? Don't you like us? The question hit Clara like a physical blow. Oh, honey, it's not that I don't like you. You're wonderful. Then how come? Clara struggled for words that a 7-year-old could understand. Your papa needs a wife who can give him certain things that I can't give him. Like what? Like more babies. Brothers and sisters for you and Jamie. Emmy frowned. But we don't need more babies. We need somebody to take care of the ones we already got. She slid off the bed and stood in front of Clara. You could take care of us. I can tell. You fixed my doll and you stopped those mean boys and you didn't get mad when I asked lots of questions. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks before she could stop them. This sweet child had no idea how complicated the adult world could be. It's not that simple, Emmy. Why not? Before Clara could answer, they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs and a man's voice calling, Emmy. Emmy, where are you? Emmy's eyes went wide. That's Papa. He sounds scared. The door burst open and Thomas Mitchell filled the doorway, his face wild with worry. His clothes were dusty from riding and his hair was messed up like he'd been running his hands through it. Emmy. He swept the little girl into his arms, holding her tight. Mrs. Patterson said there was trouble in town. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Papa. Miss Clara helped me. Thomas's eyes found Clara over his daughter's head and she saw confusion and something else, maybe gratitude, in his expression. What happened? He asked. Clara stood up, smoothing her skirts nervously. Some boys were bothering Emmy. They broke Mr. Miller's window and tore her doll. But everything's fine now. Thomas set Emmy down and knelt to her level. Are you sure you're not hurt? I'm sure, Papa. Look. Emmy held up her doll. Miss Clara fixed her all up. Thomas looked at the carefully mended doll, then at Clara. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you. An awkward silence fell over the room. Thomas cleared his throat. Emmy, go wait downstairs while I talk to Miss Hartwell. But Papa dash. Go on, sweetheart. We'll be right down. After Emmy left, Thomas stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. I heard what you did today. Standing up to those boys, taking care of Emmy. He paused. It was kind of you. Clara lifted her chin. Any decent person would have done the same. Maybe. But you didn't have to. After our conversation yesterday, you could have just walked away. She's just a little girl. She needed help. Thomas nodded, running a hand through his hair. She talks about her mother a lot. Sometimes I don't know what to say to her. You don't have to say anything. Just listen. They stood there looking at each other, and Clara could feel something shifting in the air between them. But before either of them could speak, Emmy's voice drifted up from downstairs. Papa. Miss Clara. Come quick. Jamie's here, and he's crying again. Thomas sighed and headed for the door. I should go. Thank you again, Miss Clara. For everything. As Clara watched him disappear down the stairs, she realized that something had changed today. She'd seen Thomas Mitchell not as the man who'd rejected her, but as a father struggling to raise 2 children alone. And for the first time since coming to Millfield, she'd felt truly useful. But what did it mean? And where could it possibly lead? Thunder crashed over Millfield like God himself was angry, and Clara jerked awake in her narrow bed as rain hammered against her window with the force of tiny bullets. The storm had been building all day, turning the sky black as ink and making everyone in town nervous. Mrs. Henderson had spent the evening checking and rechecking the windows, muttering about spring storms in the mountains and how they could turn deadly without warning. Another flash of lightning lit up Clara's room, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the building. She sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and was about to lie back down when she heard something that made her blood freeze. A child was screaming outside. Clara ran to her window and peered through the rain-soaked glass. At first, she couldn't see anything through the sheets of water pouring from the dark sky. Then another lightning flash showed her 2 small figures huddled under the big oak tree across the street, completely soaked and obviously terrified. Emmy and Jamie. Clara didn't stop to think. She grabbed her coat and boots and ran downstairs, her feet barely touching the steps. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen, making coffee by lamplight. Child, where are you going in this weather? The older woman called. The Mitchell children are out there. Clara shouted over the storm as she yanked open the front door. The wind nearly knocked her over as she stepped outside. Rain hit her like ice water, soaking through her nightgown in seconds. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her, but she pushed forward, following the sound of crying. Emmy. Jamie, she called, but the wind snatched her words away. Another lightning flash showed her the tree, closer now. She could see Emmy holding her little brother, both of them pressed against the trunk as if it could protect them from the storm's fury. Children. Clara reached them and immediately wrapped her arms around both of them. They were shivering so hard their teeth were chattering, and Jamie was sobbing with terror. Miss Clara. Emmy cried. We got lost. We were trying to get home, but it got so dark and the rain dash. It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe now. Clara had to shout to be heard over the storm. We need to get inside. Can you walk? Emmy nodded, but Jamie seemed frozen with fear. Clara picked him up, surprised by how light he was, and took Emmy's hand. Together they struggled across the muddy street toward the boarding house. By the time they reached the porch, all three of them were soaked to the skin and covered in mud. Mrs. Henderson was waiting with towels and blankets, her face creased with worry. Merciful heavens! Get them inside before they catch their death. Clara carried Jamie into the warm kitchen while Emmy stumbled behind them. Mrs. Henderson immediately started fussing over the children, wrapping them in dry blankets and setting them near the stove. "What were you children doing out in the storm?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. Emmy's lower lip trembled. "We went to visit Mama's grave after Papa fell asleep. We do it sometimes when he's real sad. But then the storm came and we couldn't find our way home in the dark." Clara's heart clenched. These babies had been wandering around in a dangerous storm because they were trying to comfort their dead mother. How long had they been taking care of their father's grief instead of the other way around? Jamie hadn't said a word since they'd brought him inside. He just sat in Clara's lap, his thumb in his mouth and his eyes wide with shock. When thunder crashed overhead, he buried his face against her shoulder and whimpered. "Shoo," Clara whispered, rocking him gently. "You're safe now. The storm can't hurt you here." Mrs. Henderson made hot cocoa while Clara helped the children out of their wet clothes and into some of her own nightgowns, which hung on them like tents but were warm and dry. Emmy kept looking toward the window, worrying about her father. "Papa doesn't know where we are," she said. "He'll be scared when he wakes up and we're gone." "We'll send word as soon as the storm passes," Clara promised. "Right now, the most important thing is getting you both warm." But even as she said it, Clara was thinking about Thomas Mitchell waking up to find his children missing in the middle of a dangerous storm. The man might have his faults, but he loved those children. He'd be out of his mind with worry. As if her thoughts had summoned him, there was a pounding on the front door that could be heard even over the storm. Mrs. Henderson hurried to answer it, and a moment later Thomas burst into the kitchen, dripping wet and wild-eyed. "Emmy! Jamie!" He swept both children into his arms, not caring that they were getting him even wetter. "Thank God you're safe. I woke up and you were gone," and with the storm dash, his voice broke. "We're sorry, Papa," Emmy whispered against his neck. "We just wanted to tell Mama we miss her." Thomas closed his eyes, holding his children tight. Over their heads, he looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How did they get here?" he asked. "I saw them from my window," Clara said simply. "They were stuck under the oak tree." "You went out in this storm to get them?" Clara shrugged, suddenly aware that she was standing in a stranger's kitchen in her nightgown and a man's coat, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her shoulders. They needed help. Mrs. Henderson bustled around them, bringing more blankets and hot drinks. "The children can stay here tonight," she said firmly. "It's too dangerous to take them out in this weather." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but another crash of thunder made Jamie whimper and cling tighter to his father. The little boy was clearly in no shape to go back out into the storm. "I'll take the floor," Thomas said. "I won't leave them again." "Nonsense," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Clara has the room next to mine upstairs. The children can sleep with her, and you can have the small room at the end of the hall." No arguing. Clara felt her cheeks burn. She'd been so focused on getting the children safe that she hadn't thought about what it would mean to spend the night under the same roof as Thomas Mitchell, the man who'd rejected her just 3 days ago. But looking at Emmy and Jamie, still shivering despite the warm blankets, she knew there was no other choice. "Of course they can stay with me," she said. "There's room for all of us." An hour later, Clara found herself in her small room with 2 exhausted children. Emmy had fallen asleep almost immediately, but Jamie kept waking up every time thunder rolled overhead. Each time, Clara would rub his back and hum quietly until he settled down again. Around midnight, when the storm finally began to ease, there was a soft knock on her door. Clara opened it to find Thomas standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for what you did tonight. If something had happened to them." "Nothing happened," Clara said firmly. "They're safe." Thomas looked past her to where his children slept peacefully in her narrow bed. "They trust you. I can see it in the way they look at you, the way they turn to you for comfort." Clara didn't know what to say to that. "May I ask you something?" Thomas continued. Clara nodded. "Why did you risk your life tonight for children who aren't even yours?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara thought about all the easy answers she could give, that any decent person would have done the same, that she couldn't stand by and watch children suffer. But standing there in the quiet hallway with the storm finally moving away and 2 motherless children sleeping peacefully behind her, she found herself telling the truth. "Because they needed me," she said simply. "And I needed to be needed." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about there being different ways to be a good wife." He paused. Maybe I was wrong to think a woman's only value is in the children she can bear. Clara's heart started beating faster, but she kept her voice steady. What are you saying? I'm saying that watching you with Emmy and Jamie tonight, seeing how you put yourself in danger for them, how you comfort them. He ran a hand through his hair. Maybe there are different kinds of strength, different ways to build a family. Before Clara could respond, Jamie's sleepy voice came from behind her. Miss Clara? I had a bad dream. Clara turned to see the little boy sitting up in bed, his hair sticking up in all directions and his eyes wide with worry. It's all right, sweetheart, she said, going to sit beside him. The storm's almost over. You're safe. Jamie looked at his father standing in the doorway. Papa? Are you gonna stay too? Thomas looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly and he came into the room sitting on the other side of the bed. I'm right here, son, he said gently. We're all here. Jamie lay back down, snuggling between Clara and his father with a contented sigh. Within minutes, he was asleep again. In the soft lamplight, Clara found herself looking at Thomas across the sleeping child. He was looking back at her with an expression that was completely different from the cold dismissal she'd seen 3 days ago. This was the look of a man who was seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. Clara, he said quietly, using her first name for the first time. Would you consider staying in Millfield? Not as my mail-order bride, but as... He struggled for words. As someone who might want to get to know us better? All of us. Clara's breath caught. What about what you said before? About needing a wife who could give you more children? Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking down at Jamie's peaceful face. Maybe I was so focused on replacing what I'd lost that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. These children need a mother's love more than they need brothers and sisters. And I need... He looked up at her. I need someone who understands that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up when people need you. Outside, the thunder was moving away, replaced by the gentle patter of rain that promised the storm was finally ending. But inside Clara's small room, something new was beginning, something that felt like hope. I'd like that, Clara whispered. I'd like to get to know you all better. Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since they met. Good, he said simply. That's good. As Clara settled back against her pillow with Jamie curled up beside her and Thomas keeping watch from the chair by the window, she realized that sometimes the most important moments happen not in sunshine, but in storms. And sometimes the family you're meant to have isn't the one you planned for, but the one that finds you when you're brave enough to open your heart to unexpected possibilities. But even as peace settled over the room, Clara wondered what tomorrow would bring and whether this fragile new beginning could survive the cold light of day. Thomas Mitchell's boots pounded against the wooden boardwalk like thunder as he stormed down Main Street, his face darker than the storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Mrs. Patterson had just finished telling him exactly where his children had been spending their afternoons, and her words burned in his ears like acid. Your Emmy and Jamie have been practically living at that seamstress shop, she'd said with her nose wrinkled in disapproval. That woman, the one you were supposed to marry, she's been filling their heads with all sorts of nonsense. Teaching them letters and numbers like she has some right. Now Thomas could see Clara through the window of her little shop, kneeling on the floor with Emmy and Jamie gathered around her like she was their mother. The sight made his chest tight with anger and something else he didn't want to name. She was reading to them from a book, her voice animated, and both children were hanging on every word. He pushed through the door so hard it banged against the wall. All three looked up, startled. Emmy's face lit up with joy, but it quickly faded when she saw her father's expression. Papa. Jamie scrambled to his feet, his small face worried. You were just coming home. Thomas's voice was controlled, but Clara could hear the rage underneath. Right now. But Papa, Miss Clara was telling us about the princess and the dragon, Emmy protested, still sitting cross-legged on the floor. We haven't heard the ending yet. There are no princesses and dragons, Emmy. There's only real life, and real life means doing what you're told. Thomas reached for his daughter's hand, but she pulled back. Why are you being mean to Miss Clara? The question hit Thomas like a slap. Over Emmy's head, he met Clara's eyes. She was watching him with a mixture of sadness and defiance that made his anger burn hotter. Miss Clara has her own life to worry about, he said. She doesn't need to be bothered with children who aren't her concern. Clara stood up slowly, brushing dust from her skirts. They're not bothering me. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Mr. Mitchell? Clara's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. What's the point of keeping two lonely children away from someone who cares about them? Thomas felt the familiar panic rising in his chest, the same panic he'd felt when Margaret died, when the doctor told him there was nothing more they could do. You don't understand, I understand perfectly. Clara stepped closer, and Thomas caught the scent of lavender soap and something else, something warm and maternal that reminded him painfully of Margaret. "You're scared." "I'm not scared. I'm being practical." "You're terrified that if you let anyone get close to your children, you might lose them too." Clara's voice dropped to a whisper, but her words carried clearly in the small shop. "But you're wrong about something, Thomas Mitchell. You're not protecting them. You're hurting them." Emmy started to cry, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks without a sound. Jamie moved closer to his sister, wrapping his small arms around her shoulders in a gesture that broke Clara's heart. "Look at them," Clara said urgently. "Really look at them. When was the last time you saw Emmy smile? When was the last time Jamie talked about anything besides missing his mama?" Thomas did look, and what he saw made his anger falter. Emmy's dress was too big for her thin frame. Jamie's eyes had dark circles underneath them. Both children looked older than their years, weighted down by grief and loneliness. "They're fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're not fine. They're drowning, and you're so busy protecting yourself that you can't see it. You don't know what you're talking about." Thomas grabbed Emmy's hand, more gently this time. "Come on, children. We're going home." But Emmy dug in her heels. "I don't want to go home. Home is sad and quiet and nobody ever laughs." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. "Emmy." "Miss Clara laughs with us," Emmy continued through her tears. "She teaches us songs and tells us stories, and she doesn't look sad when we talk about Mama. She looks happy." Thomas glanced at Clara and saw the truth in her face. She did look happy, or she had before he'd barged in with his anger and fear. "She makes us feel better," Jamie added in his small voice. "Like maybe it's okay to not be sad all the time." The shop was quiet except for the sound of Emmy's sniffles and the distant rumble of thunder outside. Through the window, Thomas could see people hurrying along the street, trying to beat the approaching storm. "This has to stop," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "Whatever arrangement you think you have with my children, it ends now." Clara lifted her chin. "And if I refuse? Then I'll make sure every person in this town knows exactly why you're really here. I'll tell them about your condition. About why no decent man would want you for a wife." The threat hit Clara like a physical blow. She saw the knowledge in Thomas's eyes. He knew exactly how much that would hurt her, and he was willing to use it. "Thomas," she whispered. "I mean it, Clara. Stay away from my children." But as he turned to leave, pulling Emmy and Jamie with him, something unexpected happened. Emmy broke free from his grasp and ran back to Clara, throwing her small arms around the woman's waist. "I love you, Miss Clara," she said fiercely. "Even if Papa says I can't." The simple declaration shattered something in the room. Clara knelt down and hugged Emmy tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, memorizing the feel of her small body pressed against hers. "I love you too, sweetheart," she whispered. "Both of you. Always." Thomas had to physically pry his daughter away, and Emmy's sobs echoed through the shop as he carried her outside. Jamie followed reluctantly, looking back at Clara with eyes full of confusion and hurt. After they were gone, Clara sank into her chair and put her head in her hands. The storm finally broke outside, sending rain against the windows in sheets. Lightning illuminated the shop in brief, stark flashes, and thunder shook the building. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging in Clara's heart. She'd let herself believe for just a few weeks that she could have a family, that she could be needed and wanted and loved. Now the dream was being ripped away from her again, and this time it hurt worse because it involved the children she'd grown to love as her own. A knock at the door made her look up. Mrs. Henderson stood outside, soaked from the rain, holding a covered basket. "I brought you some supper," the older woman said as Clara let her in. "Figured you might not feel like cooking tonight." "That's very kind of you." Clara's voice sounded hollow to her own ears. Mrs. Henderson set the basket on the counter and studied Clara with sharp eyes. "Tom Mitchell came by the boarding house looking like he'd been kicked by a horse. Want to tell me what happened?" Clara shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "Course it matters. Those children adore you. Anyone with eyes can see it. Their father doesn't want me around them. Thomas Mitchell is a fool." Mrs. Henderson's voice was firm. "Lost his wife and decided the answer was to lock his heart up tight. But you can't protect yourself from pain by refusing to feel anything at all." Clara walked to the window and watched the rain pour down. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I should have stayed away from them from the beginning." "Why? Because you can't give them brothers and sisters?" Clara spun around, shocked. "How did you—" "Child, this is a small town. Word gets around." Mrs. Henderson's expression was gentle. "But let me tell you something. I've watched you with those children for weeks now. You've got more mother in you than plenty of women who've birthed a dozen babies. Thomas doesn't see it that way. Thomas is scared. But that doesn't make him right. Mrs. Henderson moved to the door, then paused. You know, my late husband and I never had children of our own. Couldn't, no matter how we tried. For years, I thought that made me less of a woman. Clara waited, sensing there was more. Then I started taking in boarders. Young folks, mostly far from home and family. And I realized something. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Family isn't just about blood. It's about love. It's about showing up for people when they need you. You've been more of a mother to Emmy and Jamie these past weeks than anyone since their mama died. After Mrs. Henderson left, Clara sat alone in her shop listening to the storm rage outside. Thunder crashed overhead and lightning lit up the street in quick, brilliant flashes. The rain showed no signs of stopping. She thought about packing her bags, about taking the eastbound train and leaving Millfield forever. It would be easier than staying and seeing Thomas and the children around town, knowing she could never be part of their lives. But as she sat there in the flickering lamplight, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she'd found a place where she felt truly needed. Not as a wife or a potential mother, but as herself. Emmy and Jamie loved her not because of what she could give them, but because of who she was. And Thomas Mitchell, for all his fear and anger, couldn't take that away from her. The storm was starting to ease when Clara made her decision. She wouldn't leave Millfield. She wouldn't run away from the first real family she'd ever had, even if that family came with complications she'd never expected. But first, she had to figure out how to fight for something she'd never thought she deserved. The sunrise painted the mountains gold and pink as Thomas Mitchell sat on his front porch, cradling a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He hadn't slept all night, and his eyes burned with exhaustion and something deeper, a guilt that gnawed at him like a persistent toothache. Inside the house, Emmy and Jamie were still sleeping, but their dreams had been restless. Emmy had cried in her sleep, calling for Clara, and Jamie had crawled into Thomas's bed around midnight, shivering despite the warm spring night. Papa! Jamie's small voice came from the doorway behind him. Is Miss Clara going away? Thomas turned to see his son standing in his nightshirt, his hair sticking up in all directions. The boy's eyes were red and puffy from crying. Come here, son. Thomas pulled Jamie onto his lap, feeling the familiar weight of his child's body against his chest. Why would you think Miss Clara is going away? Because you were angry at her yesterday. And when grown-ups get angry, people go away. Jamie's voice was matter-of-fact, but Thomas heard the fear underneath. Like Mama did. The comparison hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Mama didn't go away because anyone was angry, Jamie. Mama got sick. But she still went away. Jamie leaned against his father's chest. And now Miss Clara might go away too, and then Emmy and me won't have anybody who tells us stories or teaches us songs or makes us laugh. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, the same crack that had started yesterday in Clara's shop and had been widening ever since. You have me. Jamie was quiet for a long moment. Then, you don't laugh anymore, Papa. Not since Mama died. The simple truth of it took Thomas's breath away. When was the last time he'd laughed? When was the last time he'd told his children a story or sung them a song? He'd been so focused on protecting them from more loss that he'd forgotten they needed joy as much as they needed safety. Jamie, he said carefully, do you like Miss Clara? I love Miss Clara. The answer came without hesitation. She makes everything feel lighter. Like maybe it's okay to be happy sometimes even though Mama's gone. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering Clara's words from the day before. You're not protecting them. You're hurting them. At the time, her accusation had made him furious. Now, with his son's small body warm against his chest and the morning sun painting everything in soft light, he wondered if she'd been right. Papa? Are you sad? Thomas opened his eyes to find Jamie studying his face with the intense concentration only children possess. Yeah, son. I'm sad. About Mama? About Mama. And about other things too. Jamie nodded as if this made perfect sense. Miss Clara gets sad sometimes too. But she doesn't try to make us sad with her. She keeps her sadness to herself and gives us the happy parts. The wisdom in his 5-year-old son's words nearly undid Thomas. Is that what he'd been doing? Giving his children his sadness while keeping any remaining happiness locked away? Papa. Emmy appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. I heard voices. Come here, sweetheart. Thomas opened his free arm and Emmy climbed onto the porch swing beside them. For a moment, all three sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the mountains. I had a dream about Miss Clara, Emmy said eventually. She was teaching me to make flower crowns and we were laughing so hard our stomachs hurt. That sounds like a nice dream. It was. But then I woke up and remembered you were angry at her and it made the dream feel sad instead. Thomas looked down at his daughter, really looked at her. Her face was thinner than it had been a few months ago, and there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there when Margaret was alive. But yesterday when he'd seen her with Clara, she'd looked alive. Happy. Like a child should look. Emmy, can I ask you something? She nodded. When you're with Miss Clara, how do you feel? Emmy thought about it seriously. I feel like myself again. Like the part of me that got lost when Mama died. Miss Clara doesn't try to replace Mama, but she helps me remember that it's okay to still be Emmy. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. And how do you feel when you're just with me? Emmy's answer was so quiet he almost missed it. Scared. Scared of what? Scared that if I'm too happy, you'll get angry. Scared that if I talk about Mama too much, you'll get sad. Scared that if I love you too much, you might go away too. The words hit Thomas like a landslide, burying him under the weight of his own failures. He'd been so afraid of losing his children that he'd made them afraid of losing him. He'd been so determined to protect them from pain that he'd forgotten to give them permission to heal. Oh, sweetheart. Thomas pulled both children closer. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to feel scared. We know, Papa, Jamie said softly. But sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt even when they don't mean to. Another truth from the mouth of a child. Thomas sat there holding his children as the sun climbed higher, thinking about the woman who had somehow managed to give them back pieces of themselves he hadn't even realized they'd lost. Papa. Emmy's voice was hesitant. Do you think Miss Clara would still want to be our friend? Even after yesterday? Thomas thought about Clara's face when Emmy had run back to hug her. The fierce love in her eyes, the gentle way she'd whispered that she loved them both. The way she'd knelt down to Emmy's level instead of talking down to her like so many adults did. I think Miss Clara will always want to be your friend, he said. But I need to talk to her first. I need to apologize. For being mean to her? For being scared? And for letting my fear hurt all of us. Emmy sat up straighter. Are you going to ask her to marry you again? The question caught Thomas off guard. Would you want me to? Yes. Both children answered at the same time, and their enthusiasm was so genuine it made Thomas's chest ache. But what if she says no? What if she's too angry at me to give us another chance? Jamie considered this seriously. Then we'll have to show her we're sorry. We'll have to prove that we want her to be part of our family. And how would we do that? Emmy grinned, the first real smile Thomas had seen from her in weeks. We'll think of something. Miss Clara taught us that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to be creative. As his children chattered excitedly about ways to win Clara back, Thomas found himself smiling for the first time in months. Maybe Jamie was right. Maybe it was time to start laughing again. But first, he had some serious thinking to do about what he really wanted his family to look like. The walk to Clara's shop felt longer than usual, even though Thomas had made the trip dozens of times to pick up mending or drop off clothes for repair. His hands were sweating despite the cool morning air, and he'd changed his shirt twice before leaving the house. Emmy and Jamie had wanted to come with him, but he'd convinced them to wait at home. This conversation needed to happen between adults first. If Clara was willing to forgive him, and that was a big if, then they could figure out how to move forward together. The shop was closed, but Thomas could see light coming from the small apartment above it where Clara lived. He climbed the outside stairs and knocked on her door before he could lose his nerve. Clara opened the door wearing a simple brown dress, her hair pinned back loosely. She looked tired, and Thomas wondered if she'd slept as poorly as he had. Thomas. Her voice was carefully neutral. What do you want? To apologize. And to ask if we can talk. Clara studied his face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him in. Her apartment was small but tidy, with a table by the window and a narrow bed against one wall. A sampler hung on the wall with the words, "Home is where the heart is," stitched in blue thread. Would you like some coffee? She asked, moving toward the small stove. Please. They sat at her table, both holding their cups like shields. Outside, the town was waking up, horses clip-clopping down the street, the sound of hammering from the blacksmith's shop, children's voices calling to each other. I was wrong, Thomas said abruptly. Clara looked up from her coffee. About what? About everything. About you, about what makes a good mother, about what my children need. Thomas set down his cup and leaned forward. Clara, I've been so afraid of losing anyone else that I forgot what it means to actually live. Thomas? No, please. Let me finish. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. When Margaret died, I thought if I could just keep Emmy and Jamie safe, if I could just protect them from any more pain, that would be enough. But I was wrong. They don't just need safety. They need joy. They need someone who sees them as more than just reminders of what we've lost. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. They're wonderful children. They are. And they love you. Thomas's voice cracked. They love you in a way I haven't seen them love anyone since their mother died. And I was so jealous of that, so afraid of what it meant, that I tried to destroy it. You were protecting them the only way you knew how. I was being a coward. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Do you know what Jamie told me this morning? He said I don't laugh anymore. That I haven't laughed since Margaret died. Clara was quiet, waiting for him to continue. He was right. I haven't laughed, I haven't sung, I haven't told them stories or played games or done any of the things that make childhood magical. I've been so busy trying to shield them from sadness that I forgot to give them reasons to be happy. Thomas turned back to face her. But you did. In just a few weeks, you gave them back something I didn't even realize they'd lost. You gave them permission to be children again. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I love them, Thomas. I know they're not mine, I know I have no claim to them, but I love them as if they were. That's what makes you perfect for them. Thomas moved back to the table and knelt beside Clara's chair. Clara, I know I have no right to ask this after the way I've treated you. I know you probably never want to see me again. But... He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Would you consider marrying me? Not because I need a housekeeper or because the town expects it, but because I think we could build something real together. Because I think we could be a family. Clara stared at the box without taking it. What about children? What about the sons you need to help with the ranch? Thomas opened the box, revealing a simple gold band, not the elaborate ring he'd given Margaret, but something new, something that belonged only to Clara. I already have the children I need. Emmy and Jamie are my family, and if you'll have us, you could be too. As for sons, he smiled. Maybe someday we'll adopt some boys who need a home. Or maybe Emmy will grow up to be the rancher in the family. She's certainly stubborn enough for it. Clara laughed despite her tears. She is that. So, what do you say? Will you take a chance on a fool who finally figured out what really matters? Clara looked at the ring, then at Thomas's face, then out the window toward the mountains that had become home to her. Finally, she held out her hand. Yes, she whispered. But only if you promise me something. Anything. Promise me we'll fill our house with laughter. Promise me we'll teach our children, all of our children, however they come to us, that love multiplies instead of divides. Promise me we'll never be so afraid of losing each other that we forget to enjoy being together. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger and brought her hand to his lips. I promise. All of it. As he kissed her hand, Clara felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she'd never experienced before. This wasn't the fairy tale ending she'd once imagined, but it was something better. It was real, and it was theirs, and it was built on a foundation of love that had already been tested and proven strong. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Millfield, Colorado, shining down on a town where second chances were possible and where families could be built from love instead of just blood. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the sound of children's laughter carried on the mountain wind. The church bell cracked through the September morning air like thunder, but Clara couldn't tell if the sound came from the bell tower or from her own racing heart as she stood in front of the cracked mirror in Mrs. Henderson's back room. Hold still, dear, or I'll stick you with this pin, Mrs. Henderson muttered, her mouth full of straight pins as she adjusted the hem of Clara's wedding dress. The ivory silk had been her mother's, shipped from Boston in a trunk that smelled of lavender and old memories. Clara had spent 3 weeks taking it in and letting it out, making it fit her smaller frame. Miss Clara, you look like a princess. Emmy burst through the door in a whirlwind of yellow ruffles, her hair finally tamed into ringlets that bounced as she moved. Behind her, Jamie peeked around the doorframe, his face scrubbed clean and his cowlick plastered down with water. Clara's throat tightened as she looked at these two children who had somehow become the center of her world. 6 months ago, she'd been the unwanted mail-order bride. Now she was about to become their mother in every way that mattered. Are you nervous? Emmy asked, climbing onto a chair so she could reach Clara's hand. A little, Clara admitted, squeezing the small fingers. Are you? Jamie stepped fully into the room, his blue eyes serious. Papa says you won't leave us after today. Is that true? The question hit Clara like a physical blow. She knelt down, not caring about her dress, and pulled both children close. Jamie Mitchell, I promise you with all my heart that I will never, ever leave you. You and Emmy are stuck with me forever. Good, he said simply and buried his face against her shoulder. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes with her apron. Now look what you've done. Got me all weepy and I haven't even put my good dress on yet. A knock at the door made them all freeze. Ladies? It's time. Bill Henderson's voice carried through the wood. Clara stood on shaking legs and took one last look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different from the frightened girl who'd stepped off the train 8 months ago. This woman had steady eyes and a straight spine. This woman knew her own worth. The walk to the Methodist church took 5 minutes, but it felt like 5 hours. The entire town had turned out, lining the wooden sidewalks and calling out good wishes. Clara recognized most of the faces now: Mrs. Patterson from the school, the Miller family from the farm, Doc Morrison tipping his hat with a knowing smile. "Look at that," someone called out. "Pretty as a picture." About time Thomas came to his senses, another voice added, and Clara felt her cheeks burn. The church was packed to the rafters, with people standing along the walls and children sitting on the floor in front. Sunlight streamed through the simple windows, painting everything gold. At the altar, Reverend Walsh waited with his Bible open, his kind face beaming. And there, beside the preacher, stood Thomas. Clara's breath caught in her throat. He wore a black suit she'd never seen before, with a white shirt so crisp it must have taken hours to iron. His dark hair was combed back, and his face was clean-shaven. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were bright with something she'd never seen there before, pure, undisguised joy. The organ wheezed to life, playing a hymn Clara recognized from her childhood. Emmy walked down the aisle first, scattering flower petals with the serious concentration of someone entrusted with an important job. Jamie followed, carrying the rings on a small pillow, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused on not dropping them. Then it was Clara's turn. She walked slowly down the aisle, past faces that had become familiar, past neighbors who had watched her transform from outsider to family member. But she barely saw them. Her eyes were fixed on Thomas, on the man who had learned to see past his own fear and recognize what truly mattered. When she reached the altar, Thomas stepped forward and offered her his arm. "You look beautiful," he whispered, and his voice was rough with emotion. "So do you," she whispered back, and meant it. He looked like a man who had found his way home. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat and began the ceremony. The familiar words washed over Clara like a blessing. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But Clara barely heard them. She was thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The long train ride from Boston, full of hopes and fears. The crushing rejection that had nearly broken her spirit. The slow rebuilding that had come through 2 small children who needed love more than they needed anything else. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Thomas's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the church. "Do you, Clara Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara looked into Thomas's eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the future she'd planned, but something better, something real and earned and precious beyond measure. "I do," she said, and the words felt like a prayer. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had always belonged there. Thomas's hands were steady as he made his vows, promising to honor and cherish her all the days of his life. When Clara spoke her own promises, her voice never wavered. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Walsh announced with a grin. Thomas leaned down and kissed her softly, sweetly, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. Emmy and Jamie rushed forward, wrapping their arms around Clara's waist and nearly knocking her over with their enthusiasm. "Mama!" Emmy shouted, and the word rang out like music. The reception was held in the church hall, with tables groaning under the weight of food the townspeople had brought. There was fried chicken and cornbread, apple pie and chocolate cake, and enough coffee to float a battleship. The Hopkins boys had brought their fiddles, and soon the hall was alive with music and dancing. Clara found herself swept from conversation to conversation, accepting congratulations and well-wishes from people who had become more than neighbors, they had become family. Mrs. Patterson pressed a wrapped package into her hands. "A little something for your new home," she said with a wink. Doc Morrison approached during a lull in the festivities, his weathered face serious. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, using her new name for the first time. "Might I have a word?" Clara's stomach clenched. "Of course." He led her to a quiet corner of the hall. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "What I did back in February, sending that telegram about your medical history, it was wrong of me. A doctor's business is with his patient, not with town gossip." Clara stared at him. "You were the one who told Thomas about my condition?" Doc Morrison nodded, his face flushed with shame. "Thomas came to me worried about losing another wife in childbirth. I thought I was helping, but I see now that I nearly cost both of you the happiness you deserved." He paused. "Can you forgive an old fool who forgot that healing isn't just about bodies, but about hearts too?" Clara felt a weight she didn't even know she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. For months, she'd wondered how Thomas had found out about her medical history. Now she understood, and more importantly, she could let it go. "There's nothing to forgive," she said simply. "Everything happened exactly as it was meant to." As the evening wore on, Clara found herself standing outside the church hall, breathing in the cool night air. The mountains rose around the town like protective walls, and stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Thomas found her there, loosening his tie as he approached. "Getting some air?" "Just thinking," Clara said, leaning into his warmth as he slipped his arms around her waist. "This morning I was Clara Hartwell, the woman nobody wanted. Tonight I'm Clara Mitchell, wife and mother and member of this community." "You were never the woman nobody wanted," Thomas said fiercely. "I was just too blind and scared to see what was right in front of me." Through the windows of the hall, they could see Emmy and Jamie dancing with the other children, their faces bright with laughter. The sight made Clara's heart squeeze with fierce protectiveness and love. "They're happy," she observed. "So am I," Thomas said, turning her in his arms so he could look into her face. "Happier than I thought I deserved to be." Clara reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of whiskers beneath her palm. "We all deserve happiness, Thomas. We just have to be brave enough to reach for it." As they walked home together through the quiet streets of Millfield, Clara thought about the future stretching out before them. There would be challenges, she knew. There would be hard times and disagreements and moments of doubt. But there would also be laughter and love and the daily miracle of family. When they reached the house that was now truly her home, Clara paused at the gate and looked back at the town. Lamplight glowed in windows, and somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. It was a peaceful place, a good place to build a life. But as she turned toward the house, one question whispered through her mind like a promise she hardly dared believe. What if the doctors back in Boston had been wrong about more than just her worth as a woman? 18 months later, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Thomas teach Jamie how to milk their new cow, while Emmy collected eggs from the chicken coop with the serious concentration of someone who took her responsibilities very seriously indeed. The May morning was perfect, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow and the mountains still capped with snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early light. Clara pressed her hand to her growing belly and smiled at the gentle flutter of movement she felt there, a secret she and Thomas had been keeping for the past month, waiting for the right moment to tell the children. "Mama, the brown hen is being stubborn again," Emmy called from the coop, her voice carrying across the yard. "Try talking to her nicely," Clara called back. "Sometimes that works better than scolding." The kitchen behind her was warm and bright, filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee. Preserving jars lined the shelves, full of vegetables from their garden and fruit from the apple trees Thomas had planted the year they married. This house had become more than a home, it had become the center of a life Clara had never dared dream she could have. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and walked through the parlor where Thomas's books sat on shelves beside her sewing basket and Emmy's collection of pretty rocks. Through the lace curtains, she could see a familiar figure on the porch. "Dr. Morrison," she said, opening the door with a smile. "This is an early visit. Is everything all right?" The old doctor stood on her porch with his black bag in one hand and an envelope in the other. His face wore an expression Clara couldn't quite read, part excitement, part bewilderment. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wonder if I might have a word with you and Thomas. I've received some rather interesting news from a colleague back east." Clara's stomach tightened. "What kind of news?" "The kind that might interest a woman who was told she could never bear children," Dr. Morrison said gently. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe, her knees suddenly weak. "I don't understand. May I come in?" "This is a conversation better had sitting down." Clara led him to the parlor, her hands shaking as she gestured to Thomas's favorite chair. Through the window, she could see her husband still patiently showing Jamie the proper way to handle the cow, completely unaware that their world was about to shift again. "Dr. Morrison," Clara began, but he held up a hand. "Let me explain first. Do you remember Dr. Whitman from Boston? The last physician you consulted before coming west?" Clara nodded. Dr. Whitman had been the kindest of the doctors she'd seen, the one who had delivered his verdict with genuine regret rather than cold professionalism. He's been following new research into women's health, particularly regarding fertility. It seems that many of the conditions they thought were permanent, well, they're not always as permanent as we believed. Dr. Morrison opened the envelope and pulled out several pages covered in medical terminology that Clara couldn't begin to understand. "What are you saying?" Clara whispered. "I'm saying that the medical knowledge we had 3 years ago was incomplete. Dr. Whitman has been tracking cases of women who were told they were barren only to conceive years later when their bodies had healed from whatever had been causing the problem." Clara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "You mean the doctors were wrong?" "Not wrong exactly. They were working with the best knowledge they had at the time. But medical science is always learning, always growing. And sometimes," Dr. Morrison smiled, "sometimes our bodies surprise us. A sound from the kitchen made them both turn. Thomas stood in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands still dusty from the barn. His eyes moved from Clara's pale face to Dr. Morrison's gentle expression. "What's going on?" he asked, and Clara could hear the edge of fear in his voice. After losing his first wife, any visit from the doctor made him nervous. "Sit down, Thomas," Dr. Morrison said. "I have some news that might interest both of you." Thomas sat beside Clara on the sofa, his hand immediately finding hers. She could feel the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers, hands that had learned to be gentle with her heart as well as her body. Dr. Morrison explained again about the letter from Boston, about new research and changing understanding. As he spoke, Clara watched Thomas's face change from concern to confusion to something that might have been hope. "Are you telling us that Clara might be able to have children after all?" Thomas asked. "I'm telling you that the medical certainty you were given 3 years ago may not have been as certain as everyone believed." Dr. Morrison looked directly at Clara. "Have you noticed any changes in your monthly cycles? Any symptoms that might suggest?" Clara's face burned. Even after 18 months of marriage, discussing such intimate matters with anyone other than Thomas felt overwhelming. But she forced herself to answer. "I haven't had my monthly bleeding in 2 months, she admitted. "I thought it was just stress or maybe something I ate." Dr. Morrison's smile grew wider. "Mrs. Mitchell, I believe you may already be proving those Boston doctors wrong." The silence in the parlor was so complete Clara could hear the ticking of the mantel clock, the distant sound of the children's voices in the yard, the rapid beating of her own heart. "Are you saying?" Thomas's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Are you saying Clara is expecting?" "I think that's very likely. If you're willing, I could examine you and give you a definite answer." Clara looked at Thomas, seeing her own shocked joy reflected in his face. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of being the woman who couldn't have children. She had built her identity around what her body couldn't do, had found her worth in other ways. The possibility that everything she'd believed about herself might be wrong was almost too much to absorb. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd like to know for certain." The examination took place in the bedroom, with Thomas pacing the hallway outside like an expectant father, which Clara realized with a burst of amazed laughter he might actually be. Dr. Morrison was gentle and professional, asking questions and making notes in his careful handwriting. When he was finished, he sat back with the expression of pure satisfaction. "Mrs. Mitchell, unless I'm very much mistaken, you're about 3 months along. The baby should arrive sometime in November." Clara stared at him, her hand automatically moving to her belly. "A baby?" "A baby," Dr. Morrison confirmed. "And from what I can tell, both you and the child are perfectly healthy." The door burst open and Thomas rushed in, his face wild with hope and fear. "Well?" Clara looked up at her husband, this man who had learned to love her not for what she could give him, but for who she was. The man who had married her knowing she might never give him biological children, who had built a family with her based on choice and commitment rather than blood. "We're going to have a baby," she said, and the words felt like magic on her tongue. Thomas sat down hard on the edge of the bed as if his legs had given out. "A baby," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "Now, there are precautions to take," Dr. Morrison said, pulling out a small notebook and beginning to write. "Given your history, we'll want to monitor you closely. Plenty of rest, good nutrition, no heavy lifting." But Clara barely heard him. She was thinking about Emmy and Jamie, about the joy on their faces when they learned they would have a little brother or sister. She was thinking about the nursery they would need to prepare, about tiny clothes and sleepless nights and all the beautiful chaos that came with a baby. Most of all, she was thinking about the incredible turn her life had taken. 3 years ago, she had been told she was broken, useless, unable to fulfill a woman's basic purpose. She had come west as damaged goods only to be rejected and cast aside. But through rejection, she had found acceptance. Through loss, she had found love. Through believing she was worthless, she had discovered her true worth, not in what her body could produce, but in the capacity of her heart to nurture and heal and love without condition. After Dr. Morrison left, Clara and Thomas sat together on their front porch, watching Emmy and Jamie play with the barn cats. The children didn't know yet about the baby growing inside Clara's body, but they would soon. There would be excitement and questions and probably some jealousy as they adjusted to the idea of sharing their parents' attention. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked, his arm tightening around Clara's shoulders. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "After Margaret, after what happened to your first wife." "That won't happen to you," Thomas said fiercely. "Dr. Morrison says you're strong and healthy. And medical care is better now than it was 3 years ago." Clara leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid steadiness of his presence. "I keep thinking about the woman I was when I first came here. So desperate to be wanted, so willing to accept crumbs of affection. I thought having a baby was the only way to prove I was worth loving. And now? Clara watched Emmy patiently teaching Jamie how to braid grass into a rope, saw the concentration on their faces and the love in their interactions. These children had taught her that family wasn't about blood or biology, it was about showing up day after day with open arms and an open heart. Now I know better, she said. I know that worth isn't something you earn by meeting other people's expectations. It's something you already have just by being human. Just by being you. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the baby growing inside her. She had found her place in the world not by becoming what others needed her to be, but by becoming fully, authentically herself. The baby would be a gift, a miracle she had never expected to receive. But her life was already complete. Her family was already whole. Everything else was just blessing upon blessing, grace upon grace. And as Emmy and Jamie ran up the porch steps to tell them about their grass rope and their plans for a fort in the apple tree, Clara smiled and opened her arms to embrace all the love her heart could hold.